Hi friends. Tonight we step into a world where the wind screams like a living beast, tearing at your skin, sinking into your bones, and burying the earth in endless white. You force your way through knee-deep drifts, every step heavy as if dragging chains. The cold eats at your fingers until you wonder if they're even still there. This is no ordinary storm. It's a blizzard, merciless, relentless, the kind that doesn't just freeze your body, but makes you doubt you'll ever see another sunrise. Without a plan, you won't. Before we continue, if you truly enjoy these journeys into history and survival, take a moment to subscribe. And while you're here, tell me your location and local time down in the comments. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, and let's step deeper into the storm. The snow closes around you, muffling the world until even your own heartbeat feels far away. Flakes whip into your mouth as you breathe, burning your lips and throat. You quickly realize the brutal truth: without shelter, you are nothing but a shadow about to be erased. It's a lesson every Native American community living on the northern plains, in the forests of the Northeast, and across the snow-buried West understood. Shelter was never optional, it was survival. For tribes like the Lakota on the Great Plains or the Ojibwe in the northern woodlands, architecture was a direct response to the weather. Their lodges, tepees, and wigwams weren't just homes. They were engineered shields against storms that could kill within hours. Picture a Dakota child stumbling through camp, clutching a mother's cloak as snow lashes against swaying teepee poles. That child doesn't know about insulation, air circulation, or aerodynamics. All they know is that inside, there is fire, warmth, and family. And here's the paradox: the very snow that feels like an enemy is also one of the best protectors. When packed tightly, it traps air, holding warmth inside. Even modern scientists note that igloos, made entirely from snow, can be far warmer than the outside air, heated by nothing more than body heat and a small flame. Plains tribes didn't build igloos, but they often banked snow around their teepees, sealing out the wind and turning fragile walls into natural insulation. Survival wasn't brute strength, it was clever design. Historians still debate how early shelters were built on the plains. Were they simple, temporary hideouts, or more permanent structures for long winters? The answer drifts through time like echoes of the storm itself. What is certain is this: to survive, you had to adapt, to bend nature into something livable. That's where fire enters the story. Imagine fumbling with frozen fingers, trying to coax a spark from steel and flint while the blizzard howls. Every culture across the snowbound regions of North America mastered the art of keeping those first fragile embers alive. On the plains, where trees were scarce, dried buffalo dung became precious fuel. It burned slowly, evenly, and reliably. In the forests, cedar, birch bark, and pine resin were favored, chosen for how quickly they caught, even when damp. The fire wasn't just warmth. It was light, food, safety, and spirit. In every lodge or wigwam, the hearth burned at the center, smoke drifting through a hole above. It was the pulse of survival. Some tribes even carried glowing coals wrapped in bark or tucked inside a horn when moving camp, literal embers of yesterday's fire, carried like treasure through the snow. But fire alone was dangerous. Sparks too close to hides, flames too high, and the very thing keeping you alive could turn into disaster. Stories tell of teepees consumed by fire in the middle of storms. Families forced into the blizzard with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The balance between fire's gift and its danger was a lesson every child grew up knowing. Inside, however, around the flames, life continued. Children laughed when smoke stung their eyes, elders joked that smoke followed them no matter where they sat, and families found comfort in the glow. Even in the harshest nights, fire gave people not just heat, but hope. Yet no matter how steady the flames, you still needed walls strong enough to resist the storm. That's when snow itself became the unlikely ally. Imagine carving a hollow into a drift, crawling inside, and finding sudden stillness. Outside, the wind screams. Inside, silence presses like a blanket. Snow muffles, insulates, protects. On the plains, tribes often packed snow around teepees, sealing the base like a natural foundation. Hunters sometimes dug small snow huts as emergency shelters on long journeys, cramped, cold, but life-saving. Children even practiced survival unknowingly, turning snowbanks into tunnels and forts. What seemed like play was training for the storms they'd one day face. In this way, snow became both the danger and the salvation. Now picture something greater, structures designed to endure not just one night, but whole seasons of deadly cold. The iconic teepee, tall and conical, rising defiantly against the storm. Its shape wasn't just beautiful, it was practical. Wind slid around it. Snow piled, then slid off. The poles swayed but rarely broke. It flexed with the blizzard instead of snapping beneath it. A teepee frame was built of 12 to 20 long poles, often lodgepole pine, lashed together and covered with buffalo hides, sometimes as many as 15 stitched into a single covering. In summer, flaps opened for air. In winter, every seam was sealed tight, extra hides draped over, and inner linings added for insulation. This is the secret of Native American survival in deadly blizzards. Fire, hides, snow, stone, and wood, fragile alone, but layered together into systems strong enough to defy the storm. The blizzard could howl, claw, and threaten to erase everything. Yet inside those lodges, families huddled together, warmed by firelight, strengthened by ingenuity, and comforted by the knowledge that they had turned nature's fury into an ally. In the end, you cannot outmuscle a blizzard. You outthink it. And the people who once called these lands home were masters of that art. The fire still glows in your mind, steady but small. It keeps you alive, but you know the truth, flames alone won't hold back a whole season of storms. You need walls. Stronger walls. Something more than a snowbank or a shallow drift hollow. That's when you look up and see them, tall, conical teepees standing against the storm like spears raised toward the sky. The teepee is perhaps the most recognizable Native American shelter, but few realize how perfectly designed it was for survival. Its cone shape wasn't just for looks. It was nature's geometry, a way to outsmart the wind. Gusts didn't batter its walls head-on, they curled around, sliding harmlessly along the angled hides. Snow piled up, but rarely clung long enough to collapse the frame. When the storm pressed harder, the teepee simply bent and swayed instead of breaking. The frame itself was built from long, straight poles, usually lodgepole pine, cedar, or spruce, lashed together into a tall skeleton. Over this, buffalo hides were sewn into vast sheets, sometimes 12 to 15 hides stitched into one covering. In summer, ventilation flaps at the top could open, letting breezes flow through. But in winter, every seam was cinched tight, every flap sealed down, and often an extra layer of hides or mats was draped over for insulation. Inside, some families even hung an inner lining of hides, creating a dead air space that trapped warmth like an ancient double-pane window. And here's a clever touch. Families sometimes dug shallow trenches just inside the teepee walls, placing their sleeping mats in those hollows. The result was like natural underfloor insulation. Cold air drifted down and away, while heat from the central fire pooled where people slept. Practical, ingenious, proof that survival wasn't luck, but knowledge. But not all tribes lived in teepees. Farther east, in the thick forests of the Great Lakes and New England, wigwams became the shelter of choice. These domed or cone-shaped structures were made by bending young saplings into arches, lashing them into a frame, and covering them with birch bark, mats, or animal hides. Their rounded shape shed snow, and their bark coverings were layered like shingles, directing meltwater away. Inside, fires burned low and steady, with smoke drifting through small vents at the top. Imagine sitting in a wigwam during a snowstorm. The bark walls creak as gusts press against them, but they hold. The fire glows in the center, drying clothes strung above, warming stones tucked into furs. Outside, the forest roars with the storm, but inside, voices rise in song, stories, and laughter. The wigwam wasn't just a shelter. It was a circle of survival. Move west again, and you find something even more permanent, the Earth Lodge. Built by tribes such as the Mandan and Hidatsa along the Missouri River, these were semi-subterranean homes, massive timber frames covered with layers of sod and earth. From the outside, they looked like low, grassy mounds. From the inside, they were warm fortresses. The walls, thick with packed soil, resisted both wind and snow. The roof beams supported heavy loads, while a central smoke hole doubled as a skylight. Families could gather in earth lodges through the entire winter, secure even in the fiercest blizzards. Archaeologists have found remains of these structures still intact centuries later, proof of how resilient they were. And here's a quirky detail. Inside some earth lodges, families dug small pits used for storage, lined with dried grass or bark to keep food cool and safe. In winter, when hunting was scarce, these pits were lifelines. Imagine reaching into the earth itself for dried corn or smoked meat while the storm rages above you. It wasn't just architecture. It was strategy, season after season. Of course, not every shelter was built to last months. Sometimes storms caught hunters far from camp. In those moments, quick thinking made the difference. A drift hollow, a hastily built snow wall, or even a brush lean-to could mean life instead of death. Survival demanded flexibility, knowing when to build strong and when to build fast. But whether in a teepee, a wigwam, or an earth lodge, the principles were the same: use what the land gives you. Snow to insulate. Wood to frame. Hides or bark to cover. Fire at the heart. Layer each element, and together they created a shield stronger than any one piece alone. Listen closely now. The storm is still raging, but from within those walls you hear something else: laughter, drum beats, prayers, the soft murmur of voices telling stories. For native communities, shelter wasn't just about survival of the body. It was survival of the spirit. The blizzard outside could roar, claw, and threaten to erase everything. But inside those lodges, those tepees, those bark-covered wigwams, families endured. They endured because they understood something we often forget: you don't conquer nature. You learn to live with it, to bend it, to turn its fury into your protection. That was the genius of Native American survival. And it's why, centuries later, their shelters still stand as some of the most remarkable designs ever made for life in a deadly winter world. In the heart of winter, when the winds turned into icy daggers and snow buried entire valleys, survival depended on knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Native Americans had no modern heating, no heavy machinery to carve out a safe place. Instead, they relied on their deep understanding of the land and its hidden gifts. One of the most remarkable shelters they built was the Snow Lodge, a structure shaped not unlike an igloo, but adapted to their own environments. Packed snow was more than frozen water, it was insulation. When cut and shaped properly, blocks of snow became walls thick enough to block the worst of the blizzard's bite. Inside, a small fire could raise the temperature dramatically, turning a deathly cold night into something bearable. But snow lodges weren't the only answer. In the dense forests, tribes carved out lean-tos, simple but effective shelters made from branches and bark. They stacked pine boughs thickly, layering them to repel wind and trap warmth. Positioned with their backs against the storm, these lean-tos acted like shields, breaking the fury of the wind and giving families a place to huddle close together. Animal hides played an equally crucial role. Buffalo, elk, and deer skins were stretched over frames or draped across shelter walls, providing insulation against both cold air and dampness. These hides, treated with fat or smoke to make them water-resistant, turned fragile wooden frames into sturdy winter homes. Every design carried the wisdom of centuries. These shelters weren't just about escaping the storm, they reflected a philosophy of balance with nature. Rather than trying to conquer the blizzard, Native Americans worked with what it offered: snow for insulation, wood for framing, and hides for warmth. In a storm that could claim lives within hours, these shelters made the difference between survival and tragedy. They weren't grand or permanent, but they were perfectly adapted to a world where resilience meant reading the land and respecting its power. Inside these winter shelters, survival became a daily ritual. The storm might rage outside, but within those walls of snow, bark, and hides, families created small worlds of warmth and endurance. The fire was the heart of it all. Not a roaring blaze, too much smoke could fill the shelter and suffocate everyone, but a carefully managed flame. Dried wood, collected and stored before the storm, fed the fire slowly. Sometimes animal fat was added to stretch the burn longer. The glow of that small fire was more than heat, it was hope, a reminder that life endured even in the fiercest cold. Around the fire, families huddled close. Mothers wrapped children in layers of fur and buffalo hide, whispering stories to keep fear at bay. Elders passed on lessons: how to recognize safe snow for building, which trees provided the best shelter, how to hear the warning sounds of shifting ice in the wind. These weren't just tales, they were survival codes, memorized by the young so the knowledge would never be lost. Food, too, was a challenge. Before blizzards set in, tribes prepared dried meat, pemmican, and smoked fish, lightweight but full of energy. These were stored in animal skin bags, safe from dampness. In the shelter, families ate sparingly, every bite measured, every piece a promise of another day survived. Water was drawn from melted snow, but with care. They knew never to eat snow directly, it stole warmth from the body. Instead, it was melted by the fire, sometimes mixed with herbs or berries gathered earlier in the season to strengthen the spirit as much as the body. The shelter was more than wood and snow, it was a sanctuary. Outside, the storm howled like a living beast, clawing at the walls, but inside, the community endured. They trusted their ancestors' wisdom, their own preparation, and above all, their unity. It was not comfort in the way we know it today. It was survival, raw, fragile, but strong enough to carry them through nights that could kill the unprepared in hours. And when the storm finally broke, when silence fell across the snow-buried land, they emerged alive, because they had never forgotten how to live with the earth, even at its most merciless. When the blizzards finally loosened their grip and the white silence of winter settled, survival was not the end of the struggle, it was the beginning of rebuilding. Native Americans knew that the storm was only one enemy, hunger, exhaustion, and the next wave of cold could be even harsher. That is why their shelters were never abandoned thoughtlessly. As soon as the winds calmed, families inspected the walls of snow lodges and lean-tos. Cracks in the packed snow were quickly filled in with fresh blocks, while sagging pine boughs were reinforced with new layers cut from the forest. Animal hides, stiffened by ice, were thawed, dried, and restretched, keeping the shelter strong against the next storm. Nothing was wasted, because every piece of wood, bark, and hide could mean survival later. Outside, hunters and gatherers stepped carefully into the deep snow. Tracks of deer, rabbits, or elk revealed where food might be found. Skilled hunters moved silently, conserving strength, carrying with them snares, bows, and knowledge of the land passed through generations. The women and elders gathered firewood, digging beneath snowdrifts for branches buried by storms. Even children took part, carrying small bundles of twigs, learning early that survival was a shared responsibility. The landscape after a blizzard was haunting, trees bent under frozen weight, rivers locked in ice, valleys transformed into endless white plains. Yet to Native Americans, it was also an open book. They read the bends of branches to predict wind shifts, studied the snow's surface to judge its depth and strength, and listened to the silence for signs of approaching weather. Rebuilding was never just about fixing shelters. It was about preparing for what lay ahead. Food caches were checked, fires were restoked, and shelters were adjusted to withstand another round of storms. Families stored fresh water by melting snow in large containers, knowing that the next blizzard might trap them indoors for days. Through these rituals of repair and preparation, they turned survival into resilience. The storms could strip the land bare, but they could not strip away their determination. Each repaired shelter stood as proof. They had endured, they had adapted, and they would face the next storm with the same strength. Because to the Native Americans, a blizzard was not just a test of the body, it was a test of memory, wisdom, and unity. And every storm they survived carried the voice of their ancestors forward into another generation. Centuries may have passed, but the lessons Native Americans carved into the frozen winters have not lost their power. In today's world of technology, heated homes, and instant communication, it can be easy to forget that survival once depended on nothing but human skill, knowledge, and respect for nature. Yet, when we look at how Native Americans endured deadly blizzards, we see wisdom that still matters deeply, even now. First, their shelters teach us the value of using the land itself as protection. Snow, which to many is only a threat, became their ally. Instead of fearing it, they shaped it into walls of insulation. Today, survival experts still teach this principle. Nature's challenges can also be its solutions, if we know how to read them. Second, their methods highlight the importance of preparation before crisis. Native Americans didn't wait for the storm to strike. Food was dried in advance, firewood gathered, and hides prepared long before winter arrived. In our modern lives, the lesson is clear: whether facing natural disasters or personal hardships, preparation often makes the difference between safety and danger. Third, their survival was not just physical, it was communal. Families huddled together, shared warmth, divided food, and passed on stories to strengthen the spirit. In moments when the world outside seemed merciless, unity kept them alive. Even today, in emergencies, human connection, neighbors helping neighbors, families staying close, remains one of the most powerful tools for survival. Finally, their story is a reminder of respect for the natural world. Native Americans did not try to dominate the blizzard or curse it into submission. They adapted, listened, and worked with what the earth provided. That humility, the understanding that humans are part of nature, not above it, is a lesson more urgent than ever in a time of climate change and environmental strain. The shelters built against deadly blizzards were more than engineering feats. They were symbols of resilience, wisdom, and balance. They remind us that survival is not about conquering nature, but about learning from it, respecting it, and moving in harmony with its power. Even now, when the wind howls across a winter night, their legacy whispers, with knowledge, preparation, and unity, even the deadliest storm can be endured. As the snow drifts settled and silence returned to the land, the shelters left behind stood as more than mere structures. They were monuments to human resilience, testaments to the strength of knowledge carried in the hearts of those who refused to yield to nature's fury. For the Native Americans, each blizzard survived was not just another season conquered, it was a story etched into memory, a lesson passed down in whispers by the fire. These shelters represented more than wood, snow, and hides. They represented unity, foresight, and faith in the wisdom of their ancestors. Imagine stepping into one of those shelters, the walls glowing faintly from a fire's light, the scent of pine and smoke in the air, the sound of the storm raging just beyond. Inside, families clung to warmth, to each other, and to the certainty that survival was possible. That moment, fragile yet unbreakable, was the very essence of endurance. And now, centuries later, their ingenuity still speaks to us. It tells us that even in the harshest of storms, whether of snow, or of life itself, we carry within us the ability to endure, adapt, and rise again. The shelters may have melted into the past, but the spirit that built them still survives in every lesson of resilience we remember today. So the next time the winter wind howls against your window, think of those who once faced storms with nothing but nature's tools and their own courage. They remind us that survival is not only about enduring the storm outside, it is about keeping alive the fire within. The legacy of these shelters does not end with survival alone, it extends into culture, tradition, and the values that shaped entire communities. For Native Americans, every storm endured was not just about living through the cold, but about strengthening the bonds of kinship and respect for the natural world. These shelters became classrooms in the wild. Children learned by watching their parents cut snow blocks, layer pine boughs, and stretch animal hides across wooden frames. They discovered how every step, no matter how small, contributed to the family's survival. In those frozen nights, young ones were not only kept warm, they were being prepared to become the next keepers of wisdom. For the elders, blizzards were moments to pass down stories that carried more than entertainment. Around the flickering fire, they told of ancestors who had faced storms even more brutal, of spirits who guided hunters through the snow, of lessons written in the land itself. These tales, stitched with courage and memory, gave meaning to the struggle. The shelter became not only a refuge for the body but also a cradle for the spirit. Today, when we look back at how Native Americans built these sanctuaries against deathly cold, we are reminded that survival is never just physical, it is cultural, spiritual, and communal. Their resilience lives on in traditions still honored by many tribes, and in the practices that inspire modern survivalists who continue to learn from their ingenuity. In the end, the shelters stand as quiet symbols of a truth as old as humanity itself. When the storm rages, strength is found not in walls of stone or steel, but in the wisdom of ancestors, the warmth of family, and the unbreakable will to endure. And so, the blizzards came, again and again. And still, Native Americans endured. They faced the storm not with fear, but with knowledge, and in doing so, they left behind a legacy that whispers through the snow even today. The camera pulls back across a frozen landscape, white fields stretching to the horizon, the faint outline of pine trees bending under the weight of ice. The wind howls, carrying with it the memory of storms that once threatened every living thing. Yet in that vast silence, a truth emerges: against all odds, people endured. Inside those modest shelters, snow lodges glowing with firelight, lean-tos braced against the gale, hides stretched tight against the cold, families clung not just to warmth, but to life itself. The storm was merciless, but so was their determination. As the modern world faces its own storms, whether environmental disasters, climate change, or the chaos of society, the story of these shelters feels more urgent than ever. They remind us that technology may change, but the core of survival remains the same: preparation, unity, and respect for the world that sustains us. So when we ask how Native Americans built shelters to survive deadly blizzards, the answer is not found only in wood, snow, or hides. It is found in the wisdom of a people who proved that even in the fiercest storm, humanity's strength is not in what we build, it is in how we endure, together. The storm outside finally begins to fade, its voice dwindling to a tired whisper across the plains. The snow still lies heavy, the air still burns with cold, but inside, behind the walls of hide, snow, and firelight, you feel something powerful: safety. Not absolute safety, but enough to make it through the night. And that is the true story here. For Native American communities, survival was never about building fortresses that could defy nature forever. It was about learning to bend, to adapt, and to meet the storm with ingenuity instead of defiance. Every teepee raised, every snow wall packed, every ember carried through the wilderness was a reminder that the fiercest enemy could also provide the tools of salvation. Snow became shelter. fire became heart, and community became shield. So as you sit here in your imagination, listening to the last gusts of wind, remember this: survival is not just about enduring the cold. It is about transforming fear into knowledge and chaos into order. It is about choosing to live, no matter how merciless the storm may be. The blizzards of the past have long melted away, but their lessons remain, waiting for us to hear them, waiting for us to carry them forward. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you feel the world closing in around you, you'll remember that even the coldest night can be outwitted. One spark. The last embers glow, flickering like tired eyes refusing to close. Outside, the storm's fury has weakened, its once terrifying roar now softened into a hush, almost like a lullaby across the frozen land. You step out from the warmth of your imagined shelter, and the world before you is transformed. Where there was chaos, now there is stillness. Where there was fear, now there is quiet strength. The shelters of the Native Americans were never just structures. They were living classrooms. Every child who pressed close to the fire, every hunter who banked snow against a teepee wall, every elder who taught the rhythm of feeding the flame, was passing on more than technique. They were passing on survival as culture, as memory, as identity. And that memory still breathes today. In the stories told around campfires, in the knowledge preserved by descendants, in the quiet resilience of communities who carry forward traditions against the weight of history. These shelters were not temporary acts of desperation. They were testaments, proof that human beings can endure the harshest trials when they listen, when they adapt, when they respect the balance of life. The storm may end, but the lesson doesn't. Whether you find yourself lost in the wilderness, navigating modern uncertainty, or simply facing the storms within your own heart, the wisdom is the same. Build your walls with what the world gives you. Guard your fire. Hold close to those beside you. And never forget, survival is not the absence of struggle. It is the art of transforming struggle into strength. The snow will fall again. The winds will rise again. But so will we. At first, we see the faint glow of firelight leaking through cracks in the shelter, a small orange heartbeat against the endless white. Shadows of figures move inside, children huddled together, an elder stoking the flames, a hunter tightening the hide flaps against the draft. Their breaths rise in soft clouds, fading into the smoky air above. The wind outside still claws, still howls, but it no longer dominates. Against the blizzard's fury, this fragile circle of warmth holds its ground. The teepee sways but does not break. The snow-packed walls stand firm. The fire crackles defiantly, each spark a silent vow: we endure. The shot widens. Now the entire landscape comes into view, rolling plains buried under snow, forests cloaked in white silence, mountains rising like frozen sentinels in the distance. And scattered across that wilderness, tiny points of firelight glow in the night. One lodge here, another there. Whole villages hidden beneath the storm, each flame a star of survival stitched into the earth's vast canvas. And finally, the camera lifts higher, drifting above the storm itself. From the heavens, the blizzard is no longer chaos. It is a swirling dance of white across the land, ancient and eternal. Yet within it, those lights remain, small, human, fragile, but unyielding. The narrator's voice lingers as the storm fades to silence. Shelters built of hide, snow, and fire were never just walls against the cold. They were declarations of existence, whispers to the storm that no matter how fierce it roared, life would go on. And it still does. The screen darkens. The last ember fades. But the memory of warmth remains. The wind howls like a restless animal, clawing at your face, biting into your bones, and smothering the world in endless white. You trudge forward through knee-deep snow, every step heavy as if chains drag you down. The cold gnaws at your fingers until you're not sure they're even there anymore. This is no ordinary storm. It is a blizzard, merciless, unrelenting, the kind that makes you wonder if you'll ever see another dawn. Without shelter, you will not survive. And this is a truth the Native American tribes of the northern plains, the snow-covered forests, and the frozen West understood better than anyone. Shelter wasn't just a convenience. It was the difference between life and death. The Lakota, the Ojibwe, the Cree, and countless others engineered structures that responded directly to their environments. Every curve, every seam, every fire inside their lodges was a decision born from necessity. Their shelters were not monuments of stone or towering fortresses of wood, but living, breathing designs shaped by wind, snow, and survival. Tepees, wigwams, earth lodges, each was more than a home. Each was a weapon against the storm. Picture a Dakota child stumbling into camp, clinging to their mother's cloak as icy winds slammed against hide walls. The child might not have understood the science of insulation or aerodynamics, but they knew one thing: inside, there was fire. Inside, there was family. Inside, there was survival. Snow itself, the very enemy outside, was often turned into an ally. Packed tightly, it became an insulator, trapping heat in tiny frozen pockets. Some tribes banked snow around the bases of their lodges, sealing out the wind and transforming thin walls into thermal barriers. Hunters caught far from camp sometimes burrowed into drifts, carving crude snow shelters that became life-saving sanctuaries. And at the center of every shelter, there was fire. It was the beating heart of survival, light, heat, cooking flame, and psychological anchor. In the Great Plains, where wood was scarce, buffalo dung was burned, smoldering steadily through the night. In the dense forests of the East, cedar, birch bark, and pine resin were chosen for their ability to ignite even when damp. Fires were placed carefully beneath smoke holes, tended with skill so that smoke rose without letting snow pour in. Families carried embers from one camp to the next, wrapped in bark or tucked inside a horn, so they wouldn't need to waste precious energy striking sparks in freezing winds. Those glowing coals were more than heat, they were life carried from one night into the next. Inside, survival was layered. Hide stretched over poles, snow banked outside, furs spread across the ground, fires glowing at the center, bodies pressed together for warmth. Alone, each was fragile. Together, they created a cocoon against the merciless cold. Tepees, with their tall conical frames of lodgepole pine and coverings of stitched buffalo hide, swayed gracefully in the wind rather than snapping. Wigwams, with bent sapling frames covered in bark or mats, held fast against snow. Earth lodges, dug partly into the ground and capped with timber and sod, created insulated fortresses where entire families could ride out the longest winters. Every design was intentional. Trenches were dug inside lodges where families slept low, allowing cold air to drift along the walls while heat pooled where they lay. Smoke holes were adjusted depending on the wind's direction, preventing suffocation without losing warmth. Stones were heated in fires and wrapped in hides, then tucked into bedding like primitive hot water bottles. Even children learned the rhythm of fire, when to feed it, when to smother it under ash, when to let it breathe. Survival wasn't just practical, it was spiritual. Fires were fed with sage or cedar not only for heat, but for purification. Stories were told in the muted glow of the lodge while the storm screamed outside. Children laughed at the smoke that always seemed to follow them no matter where they sat, and elders taught patience, courage, and respect for the elements. In those moments, survival became more than endurance. It became identity. Yet danger was never far. One spark too close to a hide wall, one mistake with the fire, and the very thing keeping a family alive could consume them. Stories passed down through generations warned of teepees lost to flame in the middle of a storm, forcing families to choose between freezing outside or choking within. Survival required vigilance as much as skill. And still, through centuries of winter, Native American communities endured. They endured because they listened. They endured because they adapted. They endured because they treated nature not as an enemy to conquer, but as a force to respect. Today, we look back on their shelters not just as historical curiosities, but as blueprints of resilience. Their lessons remain. Snow can be both danger and salvation. Fire can be both lifeline and threat. Strength is not always in building walls against nature, but in bending with it. So the next time you hear the wind shrieking outside your window, imagine what it was like for those who stood against it with nothing but wood, hide, snow, and willpower. Imagine the glow of fire through a teepee wall, the quiet inside a snowbanked lodge, the heartbeat of survival pulsing in the storm. Because in the end, the shelters of the Native Americans were never just about surviving the blizzard. They were about defying erasure. About declaring to the storm, we are still here. Imagine the silence after the storm. The wind eases, the world outside buried under drifts so deep they swallow entire trees, and yet inside the lodge, there is warmth. A mother leans close to the fire, drying moccasins stiff with ice. A child burrows beneath buffalo hides, listening to the low rumble of his grandfather's voice. An elder tells a story, not just to pass the time, but to remind everyone why they are here, why they endure, why they belong. For Native peoples, survival was never only about keeping the body alive. It was also about keeping the spirit strong. The storm outside might batter their walls, but the stories within kept their hearts steady. Legends of winter spirits, trickster animals, or ancestors who once crossed frozen plains gave meaning to hardship. In this way, blizzards became teachers. They taught patience, humility, and respect for balance. But make no mistake, this balance demanded skill. Hunters knew how to judge snow by its sound underfoot. Dry, squeaking snow could mean brittle cold that would sap strength in minutes. Wet, heavy snow meant danger of collapse, so shelters had to be checked, poles reinforced, fires carefully managed. A family might rise in the night to knock snow from their teepee poles before the weight snapped them. Children were taught early that survival depended on everyone's hands. No one could be idle when the storm came. Tools were simple, but their use was ingenious. Bone needles stitched hides so tightly that even driven snow couldn't pierce them. Sinew lashing flexed without breaking in the cold. Bark strips sealed gaps between lodge poles. And always, the designs could be taken down and rebuilt, moved across the land with the seasons. Flexibility was survival. Blizzards also shaped migration patterns. Many tribes timed their movements so winter found them in places with natural shelter, dense forests, river valleys, or bluffs that broke the wind. They knew where snow drifted deepest and where it melted fastest. They read the land as carefully as we might read a map. Every ridge, every frozen creek carried memory, passed down in quiet instructions: camp here, not there. Build your fire this way. Dig your trench that way. Inside those shelters, the body rested, but the mind never stopped. Food had to be rationed. Dried meat, frozen berries, pemmican packed with fat, each bite was calculated. The fire had to be fed but not wasted. Too much would burn too quickly, too little and frost crept in. Even the smallest choices decided whether a family lived to see spring. And yet, through these trials, there was beauty. The glow of firelight against hide walls turned a storm into something distant, almost unreal. The sound of wind outside became a drumbeat, steady and constant. Snowbanks gleamed in moonlight, reflecting silver through smoke holes. Life was harsh, but it was also sacred. Every storm survived was a reminder: the people were strong enough, wise enough, resilient enough to continue. Generation after generation, these shelters carried families through winters that would have crushed the unprepared. And though the designs changed with landscapes, from snow huts in the far north, to bark lodges in the east, to tepees on the plains, the principle was always the same: use what the land gives, respect its power, and never forget that survival is a shared burden. Even now, when most of us watch the snow through glass windows and rely on heaters to warm our homes, there is something timeless in their wisdom. Strip away the modern walls, the lights, the technology, and we would find ourselves facing the same question the native peoples did: how do we endure the storm? The answer lies in what they built, not just shelters of hide, bark, or snow, but a culture of resilience. A way of life that understood storms are not enemies to conquer, but forces to outlast. And in the quiet heart of a blizzard, when the world turns white and silence presses heavy, their lessons still speak. The storm is not only an enemy, it is a test. Every winter, every blizzard, every freezing wind demanded proof that the people had listened, learned, and prepared. Those who ignored the lessons of the land rarely survived. But those who adapted carried their knowledge forward, generation to generation, until it became instinct. Children grew up watching their parents mend hides, patching weak seams before the snow came. They learned to gather wood long before the drifts grew deep, stacking it carefully where it would stay dry. They watched their elders study the clouds, predicting storms with an accuracy modern forecasts sometimes envy. For them, survival was not a sudden reaction to disaster, it was a way of life. Even the shape of a shelter told a story. Conical tepees angled the wind upward, letting it slide past instead of slamming into flat walls. Dome-shaped wigwams shrugged off snow, their curves forcing drifts to fall away instead of piling dangerously. Earth lodges, heavy with timber and soil, absorbed the storm's rage, their walls thick enough to hold warmth like an oven. These designs weren't just practical, they were elegant solutions born of centuries of observation. Inside, every detail mattered. Bedding was arranged in layers, first mats of reeds or branches to keep bodies off frozen ground, then thick hides, then furs. Air currents were understood like invisible rivers, warm air rising, cold air sinking. Trenches were dug so cold air settled low, leaving the sleeping spaces warmer. Even the placement of people followed logic. The most vulnerable, like children and elders, slept closest to the fire, while stronger bodies shielded them from drafts at the edges. Fire, too, was not a careless flame. It was tended with discipline. Sparks were shielded with stones, embers banked under ash to last through the night, logs fed slowly to stretch precious fuel. Too much smoke meant danger of suffocation, too little meant frost creeping into lungs. The fire keeper, a role often given to a responsible youth, was trusted with more than warmth. They were trusted with life. But beyond skill and strategy, there was unity. A storm could not be survived alone. Families huddled together, sharing warmth. Neighbors checked on one another, ensuring no one's fire went out. Hunters risked the wind to bring back food for the whole camp, not just their own. In blizzards, selfishness killed, but community saved. This truth was carved into the very heart of native survival. Strength was not measured by what one person endured, but by what a people endured together. When the winds eased and the snow finally stilled, the world outside often looked transformed, trees bowed under weight, rivers frozen, plains buried in silence. And yet, from the dark mouths of lodges and shelters, life stirred again. Smoke curled upward. Children's laughter broke the stillness. The people emerged, not defeated, but renewed. Each storm survived was a victory. Each shelter that held against the wind was proof of resilience. And each story told by firelight became a thread, binding one generation to the next, carrying lessons of survival into the future. Today, when we study these shelters, we see more than architecture. We see wisdom. We see courage. We see a deep, unbroken relationship with the land, a knowledge that storms will always come, but that they can always be endured. Because in the end, the shelters of the Native Americans were not just walls against winter. They were living testaments to human adaptability. They whispered the same promise to every soul who stepped inside from the raging blizzard outside: you are safe. You will survive. The storm will pass. The storm fades, leaving the land wrapped in silence. Snow stretches unbroken to the horizon, a white blanket covering all that struggled beneath it. For a moment, it seems the world itself is holding its breath. And then, smoke rises. Thin, steady, curling into the sky. From the dark mouths of lodges, families step out, their footprints marking the snow. They have endured. They have survived. These shelters, simple, humble, made of wood, hide, and earth, were more than architecture. They were lifelines. They were the difference between despair and hope, between silence and laughter, between death and survival. The wisdom of the native peoples reminds us of a truth we often forget: survival is not about conquering nature, but about listening to it, adapting to it, and respecting its power. Every blizzard eventually ends. Every night eventually breaks into dawn. And every spark of fire, no matter how small, holds the promise of life. So the story of these shelters is not just about how Native Americans survived the cold. It is about how they carried forward resilience, knowledge, and hope, generation after generation. As the wind quiets and the sun returns, the lesson remains: storms will always come, but with wisdom, unity, and respect, humanity will always rise again.